The clinking of silverware had barely started when it happened. My daughter leaned in to greet the man she's always called Pastor John, the man she's seen standing at the pulpit every Sunday since she was 5. He smiled at her, that same warm smile I'd seen 1,000 times from the back pew, but then, in the next breath, I watched his lips move, and my whole world stopped. "Your father's not welcome here." It wasn't loud. In fact, it was barely more than a whisper. But my daughter's face changed instantly. Her hand, halfway to picking up her glass, froze. She looked over at me like she'd just been told a secret she wished she could unhear. For a second, I thought maybe I had misread the moment. Maybe he said something else, something innocent. But then she looked down, her shoulders slumping in that way you only do when you've been hit with a truth you didn't ask for. I sat there, frozen, feeling the hum of conversation around the table like it was coming from underwater. Turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, it all blurred into the background. The only thing I could focus on was that one sentence, rattling around my skull: "Your father's not welcome here." What was I supposed to do? Stand up, slam my hands on the table, demand an explanation in front of everyone? Or pretend I hadn't heard, pretend this was just another Thanksgiving? I could feel the tension building in my chest, like a storm that was about to break. The thing is, this wasn't just about me and Pastor John. This moment was the final spark in a fire that had been smoldering for years. Long before my daughter was old enough to understand church politics. Long before my son was old enough to choose sides. And now here we were, in the middle of what was supposed to be a peaceful holiday, sitting on the fault line of a history nobody wanted to talk about. The worst part? My kids didn't know the full story. They had no idea why Pastor John and I barely spoke anymore, why I stopped going to Sunday service, why my name seemed to leave a bad taste in certain people's mouths. I had kept those details locked away, thinking I was protecting them from something they didn't need to carry. But in that moment, watching my daughter's eyes flicker between me and him, I realized the truth had a way of spilling out, and not always in your own words. Sometimes it bursts through the cracks like water from a dam, unstoppable and unfiltered. Questions swirled in my mind. Why now? Why say this to her instead of to me? Was he trying to drive a wedge between us? Or was this some warped version of a warning? I wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding. I wanted to believe he didn't mean it the way it sounded. But deep down, I knew better. Pastor John didn't say things by accident. And when he did speak, his words were chosen with precision, like arrows aimed at a target. And so I sat there, staring at my daughter, wondering how long I had before the whole night unraveled. Because if there's one thing I've learned about family and faith, it's this: once the first crack appears, it doesn't take much for everything to come crashing down. What happened next? Well, that's the part that still makes my heart race when I think about it. And it all started years before this Thanksgiving dinner, back when I still believed Pastor John was a friend.
To understand what happened that night, you have to know where we came from. Our family wasn't just a Sunday morning kind of church family, we were there for everything. Midweek Bible study, youth group fundraisers, Saturday morning volunteer work. If the doors were open, we were inside. Pastor John wasn't just a man in a suit delivering sermons. For years, he was like extended family. He officiated our wedding. He prayed over my children when they were born. He was there in the hospital when my mother passed away. But here's the thing no one tells you about church: it's not just a place of worship. It's a place of politics. And I was never very good at politics. Back then, I served as a deacon, which meant I saw a side of the church most members didn't. I saw the budgets. I saw the disagreements behind closed doors. And I saw decisions that didn't always line up with the values preached on Sunday mornings. I was outspoken, maybe too outspoken. I believed that if something wasn't right, it was my job to say it. That's where the cracks started forming. It began small. I'd bring up concerns about how money was being spent, like why thousands of dollars were going toward guest speaker honorariums when our own food pantry was struggling to feed families. Or why certain youth trips seemed more like luxury vacations than ministry. At first, Pastor John would smile, pat my shoulder, and assure me we were all on the same team. But behind the smile, there was a shift. I could feel it. Little by little, I found myself excluded from certain meetings. My suggestions were brushed aside. Conversations would stop when I entered the room. People I'd known for years suddenly became distant, their greetings shorter, their eyes avoiding mine. Still, I held on. I told myself that differences happen in any organization, that we could work through it. My wife at the time, God bless her, begged me to just let things go for the sake of peace. But I couldn't. Silence, to me, felt like approval of things I didn't agree with. The breaking point came during a particularly heated budget meeting. I asked why we were approving a new sound system, tens of thousands of dollars, when our missions fund was almost empty. That's when Pastor John looked me dead in the eye and said, "Sometimes, brother, the sheep don't understand the shepherd's vision." It was like a door slammed shut between us. From that day forward, our relationship was never the same. I finished my term as deacon, but when it ended, I wasn't asked to serve again. My invitations to leadership retreats stopped coming. People stopped calling when they needed help moving furniture or repairing their homes, something I'd always been the first to volunteer for. And eventually, I stopped going to church altogether. Not because I lost my faith, but because walking into that building felt like stepping into a room where everyone knew something about me I didn't. The kids didn't fully understand why. My daughter still loved the youth choir. My son enjoyed the basketball nights at the church gym. I never wanted to take that away from them, so I let them go, and I stayed home. Over time, Pastor John's presence in our lives shrank. He'd still send the occasional Christmas card or stop by if someone was sick, but the warmth was gone. Still, I never imagined it would escalate to the point where he'd tell my daughter I wasn't welcome. And that's what made his words at Thanksgiving so gut-wrenching. They weren't coming from a stranger or an enemy. They were coming from a man who once called me brother. It all started with an innocent phone call. At least, that's how my daughter described it. She had been talking with Pastor John after choir practice one Wednesday night, and in her mind, inviting him to Thanksgiving was just a natural extension of our family's open-door policy. "Dad, I already told him he could come," she said over the phone, her voice full of that naive confidence that only comes from believing the past doesn't matter as much as the present. I paused. Not because I didn't want to celebrate Thanksgiving with him, but because I didn't know if we could. There are some people you can nod to across a crowded room without a problem, but having them at your table, in your home, eating from the same dishes you've shared with your closest friends? That's a different kind of closeness. "You invited Pastor John?" I repeated slowly. "Yeah," she said, "he seemed happy about it. Said it's been too long since he's seen you." That last part made my stomach turn. Too long since he's seen me, as if he'd been missing my company all these years. The truth was, if Pastor John had wanted to see me, he knew where to find me. But he hadn't. Not once. I didn't say any of that to her. I didn't want to cloud her excitement with my history. Instead, I said the safest thing I could think of, "We'll see." Over the next week, I tried to convince myself it was just another dinner guest. Just another plate at the table. But I couldn't shake the feeling that his presence would turn the day into something it wasn't supposed to be. The tension started early. My sister called me the Sunday before Thanksgiving, her voice low, like she was afraid someone might overhear. "Is it true he's coming?" she asked. I told her yes. There was a long pause, and then she sighed. "You really think that's a good idea?" I didn't have a good answer for her. Because deep down, I knew she had a point. The last time we were all in the same room was at a funeral, and even then, the air had been thick with things unsaid. My son, on the other hand, didn't seem to care. "It's just dinner," he shrugged when I brought it up. "We'll all be fine." I envied his ability to believe that. Thanksgiving morning came, and with it, the usual chaos: pies cooling on the counter, the turkey in the oven, football on TV. But beneath all that normalcy was a knot in my chest that wouldn't untangle. Around noon, my daughter came into the kitchen with her phone in hand. Pastor John just texted, she said. He's bringing a pie. Said he's looking forward to catching up. I smiled, or at least tried to, but my mind was racing. Catching up? With me? Did that mean we'd talk about the years of silence? The arguments? The meeting where he'd called me a sheep that didn't understand the shepherd's vision? Or would we pretend none of it happened? By the time the doorbell rang, I still didn't have my answer. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, took a deep breath, and opened the door. And there he was. Pastor John. Standing on my porch like nothing had ever happened, holding a pie in one hand and a Bible in the other. I told myself I could get through one dinner. Just a few hours. Just keep it civil. I had no idea that within minutes of sitting down, he'd say something that would split the table in two and aim it directly at my daughter. From the outside, it looked like the perfect Thanksgiving scene. The dining table was packed, golden turkey at the center, gravy steaming in its bowl, candles flickering against polished silverware. Laughter bubbled here and there, but I could feel the cracks in the air, thin and jagged, ready to split. Pastor John sat 2 seats down from me, directly across from my daughter. My son was beside her, glancing between the two of them as if he already sensed the invisible tug-of-war. For the first 20 minutes, things stayed polite. Pastor John complimented my sister's sweet potato casserole, asked my brother about his new job, even laughed at one of my cousin's bad jokes. But there was an undercurrent, a faint stiffness in the way he avoided looking directly at me. Then it happened. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table, his voice just soft enough that only my daughter could hear, or so he thought. Your father's not welcome here. Time slowed. My daughter's face shifted, the color draining as she processed the words. She glanced at me, just for a fraction of a second, before quickly looking away. I froze. Fork halfway to my mouth, I stared at her, then at him. My first instinct was disbelief, maybe I misheard. But the look in her eyes told me I hadn't. I cleared my throat, my voice low but sharp. What did you just say? Pastor John sat back, feigning surprise. Oh! I was just saying that sometimes certain choices we make, well, they can close certain doors. It wasn't an answer. It was a dressed-up insult. My daughter's lips trembled. Pastor John, why would you say that? She asked, her voice cracking. He sighed, as if this was a burden he had to bear. Because, sweetheart, the Bible says we must guard the flock. And there are some influences that aren't healthy for God's people. The words landed like a slap. The influence he was talking about wasn't a stranger, a sinner from the streets, or some abstract threat. He was talking about me. Something inside me snapped. If you've got something to say, John, you can say it to me. Not to my daughter. A hush fell over the table. My sister stopped mid-bite. My cousin's fork clinked against his plate. Even the football game in the background seemed to fade into silence. Pastor John's eyes met mine for the first time all night. You stepped away from the church, he said evenly. You questioned leadership in a way that caused division. I'm simply making sure your children understand the consequences of rebellion. My daughter's chair scraped against the floor as she stood abruptly. This is Thanksgiving, she burst out. Why are you doing this here? I wanted to reach for her, to shield her from the weight of the moment, but I was rooted to my seat. The years of unspoken grievances, the cold stares, the clipped greetings, they were all here now, bleeding into the cranberry sauce and the stuffing. I took a slow breath. You think you're protecting her, I said, but all you're doing is teaching her that love has conditions. For a brief second, I thought I saw something flicker in his expression, doubt, maybe. But it was gone as quickly as it came. And then, before I could say another word, my son's voice cut through the air. My son's voice didn't come right away. First came the silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin prickle, where you can almost hear everyone's heartbeat. I could feel my own pulse pounding in my neck. My fork lay abandoned beside my plate. The turkey was getting cold, but I couldn't taste anything anymore, just the bitterness rising in my mouth. Every instinct in me screamed to stand up, to shove my chair back so hard it rattled the hardwood floor, to lean across the table and tell Pastor John exactly what I thought of him. But there was another voice in my head, quieter, urging me to hold back. If you blow up now, you'll only prove him right. I stared at him across the table, my hands curled into fists beneath the linen napkin in my lap. You don't get to define who's welcome in my family, I said, my voice low, deliberate. Pastor John tilted his head, almost pityingly. It's not about family. It's about God's family. And sometimes, we have to separate the sheep from the goats. My daughter let out a shaky breath, whispering, "Dad," like she was afraid of what might happen next. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. My kids were watching, not just listening to the words, but studying every move I made, every choice. And whatever I did next would stick with them longer than any sermon. I wanted to protect them from this mess, but that option was gone the second those words left his mouth. So I decided on something I hadn't done in years. I looked him in the eye and asked, "What exactly are you accusing me of?" The corner of his mouth twitched. "You undermined leadership. You caused discord. You challenged the authority God placed in His church. And when you walked away, you set an example that rebellion is acceptable." The word rebellion hit harder than I expected. My mind flashed back to that last heated budget meeting, to the way people had avoided me afterward. All I'd done was ask questions. All I'd wanted was honesty. But to him, questioning was rebellion. "I didn't rebel," I said firmly. "I told the truth. And if telling the truth cost me a seat in your church, maybe that says more about the church than it does about me." There it was, the edge in my voice I'd been trying to keep hidden. My son's eyes flicked between us like a referee waiting for the whistle to blow. Pastor John didn't flinch. "Truth without submission is pride," he said. I laughed, short, humorless. "Submission without truth is slavery." The tension in the room was like a stretched wire. One wrong move and it would snap. I could feel my heart hammering, my breath quickening. But before I could decide whether to push further or back down, my son straightened in his seat, his hands flat on the table. "I think it's my turn to say something," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Every head turned toward him. Pastor John blinked, caught off guard. "Go ahead, son," he said, as if expecting some polite defense of the pastor's honor. But the look in my boy's eyes told me otherwise. My son's chair scraped back as he stood, and the sound was sharp enough to make a few people flinch. He was 17, still lanky, still growing into his height, but in that moment, he carried himself like someone twice his age. "Pastor John," he began, his voice steady, "I think you've got this wrong." Pastor John's eyebrows lifted slightly, but he leaned back in his chair, giving my son the floor like he was indulging him. "And what's that, son?" "It's not rebellion to ask for the truth," my boy said. "It's not sin to want accountability. That's not pride, that's integrity." The words hit me harder than anything Pastor John had said all night. My son wasn't just defending me, he was echoing the very arguments I'd made years ago, the ones that had branded me a troublemaker in the church. "You were a kid when this happened," Pastor John said, his voice still calm. "You don't know the full story." My son didn't flinch. "Maybe not. But I do know what I saw. I saw my dad spend hours fixing the church roof after that storm, when nobody else showed up. I saw him deliver groceries to families in the middle of the night. I saw him sit with people in the hospital for hours when their own relatives wouldn't come. And you know what else I saw? I saw the way people started avoiding him when he asked why the missions fund was empty. I saw how quickly friends stopped being friends when he wouldn't just nod and smile. The room was dead silent except for the sound of my son's voice, clear and unwavering. "And I saw you," he continued, smile at him in public, then talk about him behind his back. "I saw you tell people he wasn't aligned with the vision." Pastor John's expression tightened, not much, but enough for me to notice. "You're crossing a line," the pastor said, his tone still controlled but colder now. "No," my son said firmly. The line got crossed when you came into our home and told my sister that her father wasn't welcome. You could have said whatever you wanted to him, he's an adult. But you came for her. And that's not leadership, that's cowardice. My sister gasped quietly. My daughter's eyes were wide, and for the first time that night, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. I wanted to stand up and wrap my arms around my son, but I didn't move. This was his moment, and I wasn't going to take it from him. Pastor John cleared his throat. I was protecting her from— No, my son cut in. You were protecting your image. You didn't want her to ask questions about why Dad left. You didn't want to risk her thinking you might be wrong. It was strange. In that moment, I realized my son wasn't just standing up for me, he was standing up for himself, for his sister, for the kind of honesty we'd always tried to teach them. Finally, he looked straight at me, then back at Pastor John. If this is what church leadership looks like, maybe the problem isn't the people who leave, maybe it's the people who make them want to. No one said a word after that. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Pastor John's jaw tightened, his knuckles pale against the table. And that's when I knew this night wasn't going to end quietly. Pastor John didn't speak right away. He just sat there, staring at my son like he was trying to decide whether to swat away a fly or admit the fly might have a point. His fingers drummed once against the table before he finally leaned forward, his voice low but deliberate. You want the truth? He said, his eyes moving from my son to me. Fine. Here it is. You weren't just asking questions back then, you were undermining everything we were building. You think it was about money? It wasn't. It was about trust. Every time you stood up and challenged leadership in a meeting, every time you went around us to rally support for your opinions, you planted seeds of doubt in people's minds. And doubt destroys unity. I clenched my jaw. Unity without honesty isn't unity, it's control. He shook his head slowly, like I was proving his point. That's exactly what I mean. You never understood that leadership requires sacrifice. Sometimes that sacrifice is keeping certain discussions within leadership, even if the average member doesn't get all the details. I leaned forward. You mean keeping secrets? He didn't deny it. If that's how you want to frame it, sure. But let me tell you something, brother, not every truth needs to be told to everyone. You aired our disagreements in front of people who weren't equipped to handle them. And when you walked away, you took a part of the congregation's trust with you. The air in the room was heavy, every word pressing down on my chest. My son crossed his arms but stayed quiet, his eyes darting between us. My daughter sat rigid, like she was afraid to breathe. You really believe that? I asked. That I'm the one who broke the trust? That the problem wasn't the spending, or the hypocrisy, but the fact that I wouldn't keep my mouth shut? Yes, he said simply. And I told your daughter you weren't welcome because I didn't want her thinking that kind of rebellion was something to be proud of. The words stung, not because they were true, but because he believed them so completely. For a moment, no one spoke. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the dining room clock, even the muffled noise of the football game in the other room, all of it seemed louder than the people at the table. Finally, my sister broke the silence. So you think shaming him in front of his kids is the godly thing to do? She asked, her voice sharp. Pastor John turned toward her. I think sparing them from a dangerous influence is the godly thing to do. That was it, the last straw. I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back, the legs scraping against the hardwood. Let me tell you something, John. My kids have seen me fail. They've seen me lose my temper. They've seen me struggle. But they've also seen me own up to my mistakes and fight for what's right. If that's the influence you think they need to be protected from, then maybe they're better off without yours. His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. For the first time all night, he looked unsettled. And then my son, still standing tall, added quietly, maybe it's not rebellion to walk away from something that's broken. Pastor John's eyes flickered toward him, and in that moment, I saw the crack, small, but real, in his certainty. But the damage to the room was already done. The silence didn't last. It never does in a family this big. "You know what?" my Uncle Mike said, setting down his fork with a thud. "I'm with Pastor John on this one." It was like a match to dry leaves. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. My uncle had always been the kind of man who followed authority without question, military background, chain of command, yes sir no sir type. "Of course you are," my sister muttered under her breath. Mike's face flushed. "I just think some of us forget that respect matters. You don't stand up in front of a whole church and challenge your pastor unless you're ready for consequences. That's not respect," my cousin Laura cut in, "that's blind loyalty. If the leadership's wrong, someone has to say it." The table erupted in overlapping voices, some defending me, some defending Pastor John, some just trying to change the subject back to the turkey. But the undercurrent was clear. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was a fracture that had been waiting for a chance to split wide open. Pastor John stayed quiet, hands folded in front of him, letting the chaos play out like a man who believed the truth would naturally rise to the top if he just waited. My daughter, however, wasn't having it. She looked straight at Mike. "So you think it's okay for him to tell me my dad's not welcome in his church? In our home? On Thanksgiving?" Mike shifted uncomfortably but didn't answer. "Yeah," my son said, his voice sharp. "Funny how nobody wants to answer that part." My aunt, sitting at the far end, finally spoke up. "I've been at that church for 20 years. I know Pastor John, and I know your dad. I think maybe," she hesitated, glancing around like she was testing the water. "I think maybe there's fault on both sides." "That's a nice way of saying nothing," my sister shot back. I stayed standing, hands braced on the back of my chair, scanning the faces around the table. People I'd known my entire life, people I'd celebrated birthdays and weddings and holidays with, now looking at me like they weren't sure which version of me to believe. It hit me then, this wasn't about Pastor John anymore. Not entirely. This was about how people choose comfort over truth, how they'd rather keep their worlds tidy than face the mess of calling out someone they respect. "I didn't come here to start a fight," I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "But I'm not going to sit here and pretend I did something wrong by asking questions. If that makes me unwelcome in his church, so be it. But don't tell me it makes me unwelcome at my own table." That got quiet. For a moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, the tension would settle. But then my cousin leaned toward Pastor John and said, "You don't have to put up with this, you know." He gave a small, tight smile. "I'm not here to fight either. I came to share a meal. But sometimes God uses uncomfortable moments to reveal the truth." The irony of that statement was almost laughable. My son muttered under his breath, "Guess we're all learning something tonight." And that's when my daughter, voice trembling but firm, said, "If the truth is that church comes before family for some of you, then maybe you're the ones who shouldn't be welcome here." The shock that rolled through the room was palpable. And I realized my kids weren't just defending me, they were redefining what family meant right in front of everyone. Section 9, the turning point. The tension at the table was a living thing now, breathing, pulsing, feeding off every glare and whispered comment. It was my sister who broke it, but not with more arguing. She reached under the table, pulled out a plain manila envelope, and slid it across the wood toward me. "I wasn't sure if I should bring this," she said quietly, "but I think now's the time." The envelope was worn at the edges, like it had been handled too many times. I opened it slowly, the room watching every move. Inside were photocopies, bank statements, receipts, and meeting notes from my time as deacon. "This is from the year you stepped down," my sister said, her gaze flicking to Pastor John. "And the year after." I started scanning the pages. There it was, the same discrepancies I'd tried to bring up years ago. Thousands allocated to guest services that had nothing to do with guests. Multiple leadership retreats at high-end resorts. And then, buried among them, 2 large transfers to a personal account, an account that wasn't mine. I looked up slowly. "John, care to explain why church funds were going to an account under your name?" The air in the room turned razor sharp. Pastor John's jaw tightened, but he didn't reach for the papers. That's not the full story. Then give us the full story, my son said, arms crossed. His voice was steady, but I could hear the barely contained anger in it. My daughter was leaning forward now, eyes locked on the pastor like she was seeing him for the first time. It was a temporary holding account, Pastor John said finally. The board approved it. No, I interrupted, my voice hard. The board didn't know. I know because I was on it at the time. This never came up in any meeting. I asked for every expenditure to be recorded in the minutes, and these aren't. Mike shifted uncomfortably in his seat. My aunt looked down at her plate. The silence wasn't just awkward now, it was damning. Pastor John's calm mask was slipping, just a little. Sometimes, for the sake of efficiency, decisions have to be made without dragging everyone into the details. Details? I scoffed. That's not a detail. That's thousands of dollars of the congregation's money. For the first time all night, Pastor John looked tired. His voice softened, but not in the warm way it used to. You think I did this for myself? You think I took from the church because I wanted more? I put that money aside to cover expenses I couldn't get approved fast enough for emergencies. And yes, I made mistakes. But I did it for the good of the ministry. Then why hide it? My sister pressed. He didn't answer. And that was the moment I saw it, the truth, sitting heavy in his silence. My son leaned forward. You told my sister my dad wasn't welcome because you thought he was a bad influence. But the truth is, you just didn't want him around because he might see something you didn't want seen. The words hit like a hammer. Pastor John looked at him for a long moment, then finally looked down at his plate. And just like that, the balance of the room shifted. The certainty he'd walked in with was gone, replaced by something quieter. Guilt, maybe. Or just the realization that his grip on the narrative had slipped. I didn't know yet where this would end. But for the first time in years, I felt the ground shifting in my favor. Nobody moved at first. The only sound was the faint tick of the dining room clock, each second louder than the last. Finally, Pastor John placed his napkin on the table and leaned back in his chair. He didn't look at me when he spoke, he looked at my daughter. I'm sorry, he said, the words slow and careful. I shouldn't have said what I said to you earlier. That wasn't my place. Her eyes stayed on him, searching for sincerity. Then why did you? She asked. He hesitated, then glanced at me. Because I let my pride get in the way. I saw your father as a threat instead of a brother. And when someone challenges you in front of the people you lead, it's easier to turn them into an enemy than to face what they might be right about. The room was quiet. Not all the tension was gone, not even close, but something had shifted. I nodded once. That's all I ever wanted. Not an apology, just the truth. My son crossed his arms, still wary. My sister looked relieved. My uncle, though, kept his eyes fixed on his plate, like he wasn't sure which side he stood on anymore. We finished the meal, but the mood was subdued. Conversations drifted to lighter topics, football scores, dessert, family gossip, but the undercurrent of what had happened stayed just below the surface. When Pastor John stood to leave, he paused at the door. I can't promise I'll agree with you in the future, he said, but I can promise I won't try to cut you out of your children's lives again. I gave him a small nod. Fair enough. After the door closed, my son turned to me. You know this isn't over, right? Yeah, I said, a tired smile on my face. But it's a start. That night, after the dishes were done and the kids were in bed, I sat alone in the living room, replaying the day. The words, the looks, the shifting alliances, it all felt like both a wound and a healing at the same time. I thought about the years I'd spent avoiding the church, about the people I'd lost along the way, and about how quickly a label like troublemaker can stick. But I also thought about my son standing tall, my daughter speaking up, my sister sliding that envelope across the table. Family isn't perfect. Sometimes it's messy and loud and divided. But that night, in the middle of the mess, my kids showed me something I hadn't realized I needed, proof that they'd learned the difference between peace and silence, between loyalty and blind obedience. And that was worth more than any apology Pastor John could give. Because at the end of the day, people will remember the moments you spoke up and the moments you stayed quiet. And I'm glad my kids saw me do both, in the right order. If you were in my shoes, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up sooner, or stayed silent to keep the peace? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more real, unfiltered stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button, because the next one I share might just make you rethink everything you thought you knew about family and faith.